Hello Cloud Gurus and welcome to this lecture where we're going to take a look at Elastic Container Service or ECS. And if you haven't heard about Elastic Container Service before, it's a fully managed container orchestration service which allows you to run containerized workloads in AWS. But let's start off by looking at containers. So what are containers? Well, they're similar to a virtual machine, but they're really more like a virtual operating environment. And a container is a standardized unit with everything that the software needs to run. For example, libraries, system tools, code, and runtime. And the use of containers goes hand in hand with a microservices approach to building software, where applications are created using independent, stateless components or microservices which are running in containers. And so your application is made up of a number of different microservices which are usually stateless and can be stopped and started and scaled independently, and each microservice has a very specialized role. And if you haven't had much experience with microservices before and you're interested in learning more about microservices, there's actually a really good AWS white paper, which I'm going to show you now, called Running Containerized Microservices on AWS. And this is definitely worth a read through if you'd like to know a little bit more about microservices. And they also actually mention in this white paper the 12-factor app methodology, which is a methodology for building software as a service applications. And there's actually a 12-factor app website that you can go and read through, and this gives you the 12 best practices for designing stateless applications to run in the cloud. And you'll find links to both of these in the resources section for this lecture. So back to Elastic Container Service. When it comes to containers, you can either use Docker or Windows containers. And of course, we use Docker to create Linux containers, and we use Windows containers for Windows workloads. And Elastic Container Service, it actually supports both. But how does it all hang together? Well, let's break things down and have a look at the architecture of a Docker container. So here is our container, and it consists of some application code, some libraries, and a virtual kernel. And this is everything that our software needs to operate. But our container, it needs to run somewhere. And in this example, it's a Docker container. So it needs to run on Docker, and Docker is going to be installed on our operating system. And as our application grows, we can scale out by adding more and more containers. Now, there are some really important advantages to using containers and a microservices architecture. First of all, they are highly scalable. And if the application becomes overloaded, you only need to scale out the services that you need to, instead of the entire application. It's generally easier to build fault-tolerant services because everything is stateless, and a single error in one of your containers should not bring down your entire application. And finally, they are much easier to maintain than large monolithic applications. They're a lot easier to update and change because everything is broken down into smaller components. But where does ECS fit in? Well, ECS is a container orchestration service, and as you know, it supports both Docker and Windows containers. It enables you to quickly deploy and scale containerized workloads without having to install, configure, and manage your own orchestration platform. And if you've used Kubernetes before, it's actually very similar at a high level. But the advantage with ECS is that it has deep integration with AWS services like Identity Access Management, VPC, and Route 53. And with Elastic Container Service, you have a choice whether to run your containers using either a cluster of virtual machines. So ECS will run your containers on a cluster of EC2 instances, or you can use Fargate. And Fargate is the serverless option for Elastic Container Service, and it allows you to run your containers in a serverless way, so you don't need to worry about the underlying EC2 instances. However, if you want to control the installation, configuration, and management of your compute environment, then EC2 is the one to go for, because that will give you a lot more control. Now, if you already have a Docker image and you want to start deploying Docker containers to ECS, the first thing you'll need to do is create an Elastic Container Registry, and it's also referred to as ECR. An Elastic Container Registry, it's simply a place or a registry where you store your container images. So once you've stored your images in ECR, ECS connects to the registry and uses the image to deploy Docker containers. And some of the cool services which use ECS are things like Amazon SageMaker, which you can use to quickly deploy and scale machine learning models for training and inference jobs. So you can run those training and inference jobs using ECS. Amazon Lex, which uses deep learning to build conversational interfaces, for example, chatbots. And also Amazon.com, their own recommendation engine, is also running on ECS. And you don't actually need to know which services are using ECS for the exam. I just think that this is actually really interesting that they're using it themselves. So let's take a look at some of our exam tips for containers. Remember, it's a virtual operating environment, which includes everything that the software needs to run. So think libraries, system tools, any code, and runtime as well. And using containers, this allows applications to be built out using independent, stateless components or microservices running in multiple containers. ECS is a container orchestration service, and it will enable you to run your containers on clusters of virtual machines. And you can use Fargate if you want the serverless option, so you won't need to worry about the underlying EC2 instances where your containers are running. Or if you want more control, go for the EC2 option. So if you want to control the installation, configuration, and management of your compute environment, then EC2 is the option to go for. And finally, Elastic Container Registry is the place to store your container images. And of course, Docker and Windows Container are both supported. So that is the end of this lecture. If you have any questions, please let me know. If not, feel free to move on to the next lecture. Thank you.